I've been carrying mail in Pendleton County, West Virginia, for 17 years, which means I've driven approximately 4,400 routes through the same hollows and along the same ridges, the same mailboxes appearing at the same intervals in the same order, the same driveways and the same houses, and the same faces checking their boxes as I pull up. Pendleton County is the second least populated county in West Virginia, which makes it one of the least populated places east of the Mississippi, a landscape of mountain ridges and narrow valleys where the roads follow the creeks because the terrain doesn't allow any other option, and where the distances between addresses can be measured in miles of gravel and the time between deliveries can be measured in the particular patience that rural mail carrying demands. I know my routes the way a sailor knows a coastline, not just the features but the spaces between them, the rhythm of the drive, the particular sequence of curves and grades and straightaways that my body has memorized to the point where the driving is automatic and the attention is free to focus on the mailboxes and the packages and the daily concerns of a job that most people think is simple, and that is simple in the way that anything you do 5,000 times becomes simple, the complexity buried beneath the repetition until the doing of it requires no thought, and the not doing of it would require a conscious decision. The route I'm talking about is my Tuesday-Thursday route, a 62-mile loop that starts at the post office in Franklin and winds through 3 hollows and along 2 ridges before returning to town. The middle section of the route follows a secondary road through a hollow called Dry Run, a narrow valley with a creek that runs most of the year, and that in dry summers lives up to the hollow's name by going underground and leaving its bed exposed, the smooth stones and the sand showing where the water was and will be again. The road through Dry Run is paved but narrow, 1 lane with turnouts, climbing gradually from the main valley into the mountains, serving maybe 15 mailboxes over a stretch of about 4 miles, before it connects to a ridge road that takes me to the next section of deliveries. About 2 miles into Dry Run, there's a fork. The road splits, the right fork continuing up the hollow along the creek, which is my route, and the left fork climbing away from the creek through a section of forest that gets steeper and denser as it ascends. I've passed this fork approximately 4,400 times. The left fork has never been part of my route. In 17 years, I've never turned left at that fork, never had a delivery on the left road, never had a reason to take it. The left fork, as far as I knew, dead-ended at an abandoned property about 3 miles up, a piece of land that the county records showed as having been unoccupied since the late 1980s. The road itself hadn't been maintained in decades, the pavement deteriorating, the edges crumbling, the kind of road that the county acknowledges on maps, but that has been functionally abandoned, kept on the books because removing a road from the official records requires paperwork that nobody has been motivated to do. November of 2022, a Tuesday, mid-morning, the weather cold and overcast in the way that November is cold and overcast in these mountains, the clouds sitting on the ridges, the light flat, the hollow in shadow even at 10 o'clock. I was driving Dry Run at my usual pace, the truck loaded with the day's mail, the route unfolding the way it always unfolded, mailbox to mailbox, the rhythm established and automatic. I came around the curve before the fork and saw the detour sign. It was positioned at the apex of the fork, in the triangle of ground where the 2 roads diverged, a standard DOT detour sign, the orange diamond-shaped panel with the word detour in black letters, mounted on a metal post that was sunk into the ground with the stability of a sign that had been properly installed rather than hastily placed. An arrow beneath the word directed traffic to the left fork. And on the right fork, my normal route, a barrier had been placed across the road, the kind of barrier that utility companies use when they're working on a road, orange and white striped, with a road closed sign attached to it. Behind the barrier, I could see what appeared to be equipment, a truck, and what might have been a generator or a compressor, the shapes indistinct in the flat November light, but consistent with a utility crew doing the kind of work that occasionally closes mountain roads for a day. I stopped at the fork and looked at the sign and the barrier and the equipment, and I did what the sign told me to do. I turned left. Not because I was incurious, not because I didn't notice that the detour was unusual, but because in 17 years of mail carrying you learn that roads close and detours appear, and the job requires you to deliver the mail regardless of the route. And if the county or a utility company has closed my road and posted a detour, My job is to follow the detour and figure out how to reach my remaining mailboxes from whatever road the detour takes me to. The left fork climbed. The road was steeper than I expected, the grade increasing as it pulled away from the creek and ascended the side of the hollow, the pavement narrowing from one lane to something less than one lane, the edges broken and crumbling, the surface showing the particular deterioration of a road that hasn't been maintained in a long time, the cracks filled with moss and the potholes filled with water in the center line, if there had ever been one, completely gone. The forest pressed close on both sides, the trees thicker and taller than the trees along my normal route, the canopy heavy even in November when the hardwoods were bare, the hemlocks and the rhododendron, maintaining a density that blocked the sky and that reduced the already flat light to a gray dimness that made the road feel like a tunnel. The mailboxes disappeared. In the first quarter mile, there had been two, old, tilted, showing no sign of recent use, the kind of mailboxes that remain at the road's edge, long after the houses they served have been abandoned. After those two, nothing. No mailboxes, no driveways, no houses visible through the trees, no indication that the road served any occupied property. The forest was unbroken on both sides, the trees growing to the edge of the pavement, the undergrowth thick enough that visibility into the woods was limited to maybe 20 feet before the vegetation became a wall. I drove for about 2 miles. The road continued to climb, the grade steepening, the pavement worsening, the truck working harder as the surface degraded from broken pavement to something that was more gravel than asphalt. The road surface, a memory of what it had been when someone maintained it. I was beginning to question the detour, the logic of a utility company routing traffic onto a road that was barely passable, when the road leveled out and entered a small clearing and ended at a turnaround. The turnaround was a circle of gravel and mud, the kind of space that roads create at their termination points, wide enough for a vehicle to reverse direction. At the far edge of the turnaround, facing the road, was a structure. I need to describe this structure carefully because the structure is the part of the experience that I have spent the most time trying to understand, and that I have failed to understand, and that I suspect I will never understand. It was a house, or it was shaped like a house, the way a child's drawing is shaped like a house. The basic elements present, but the execution wrong in ways that accumulated into something deeply unsettling. The structure was frame construction, wood siding, a roof, windows, a door. The materials were real and physical and showed age. The wood weathered gray, the siding warped in places, the roof showing the sag of years without maintenance. It was a real building that had been standing for a long time, but the proportions were wrong. The windows were placed at heights that didn't correspond to any reasonable interior floor level, some of them 6 or 7 feet above the ground, others at knee height, the spacing between them irregular, as if whoever had placed them had understood that houses have windows, but had not understood the relationship between window placement and the interior space that the windows serve. The door frame was too tall, maybe 8 feet, and too narrow, maybe 2 feet wide, a door that a person could pass through only by turning sideways, and that suggested an occupant who was taller and thinner than any person should be. The roof pitch was steep, too steep for the footprint of the building, the roofline rising to a peak that was too high for the walls that supported it. The proportions of a house designed by something that had observed houses from the outside without ever understanding how they worked on the inside. The building had no porch, no steps, no walkway. The door was at ground level, the threshold meeting the mud of the clearing without transition, the boundary between inside and outside, unmarked by the architectural elements that every human dwelling uses to mediate the transition between public and private space. The building simply began where the ground ended, the siding rising from the mud with the abruptness of something that had been placed rather than built, set down in the clearing the way you'd set down a box. I sat in my truck in the turnaround, and I looked at the structure, and I felt the particular wrongness that the structure produced. Not fear exactly, but the cognitive disturbance of looking at something that is close enough to familiar to trigger recognition and different enough to trigger rejection, the brain reaching for the category of house and finding that the thing in front of it doesn't quite fit. The uncanny valley, except not of a face, but of an entire building, a structure that mimicked human architecture, the way a mockingbird mimics a cardinal, the form reproduced without the function, the appearance without the understanding. I turned around. I did not get out of the truck. I did not approach the structure. I reversed in the turnaround and drove back down the road I'd come up, the 2 miles of deteriorating pavement through the dense forest, the road descending toward the fork where the detour sign had directed me left. The fork was normal, the detour sign was gone, not removed, not knocked down, not lying on the ground, gone. The triangle of ground where it had been standing 20 minutes earlier showed undisturbed grass, no hole where the post had been, no impression in the ground, no evidence that a sign had ever been installed there. The barrier on the right fork was gone. The utility equipment was gone. My normal road was clear and open, the pavement showing no construction debris, no tire marks from heavy equipment, no indication that any obstruction had been present. I sat at the fork for maybe 2 minutes. I looked at the left road and the right road, and the triangle of ground between them, and I tried to construct an explanation that would account for a detour sign that appeared and disappeared, and a road closure that left no evidence, and a utility crew that materialized and dematerialized in the process. 20 minutes I'd been on the left fork. None came. No explanation assembled itself from the facts available. I took the right fork. I delivered the mail. I completed the route. I drove back to the post office, and I said nothing to anyone, because the thing I would have had to say was that a detour sign sent me up a dead-end road to a house that was built wrong, and when I came back the sign was gone and there was no evidence it had ever existed. I checked the county maps. The left fork was listed as County Road 7/3, last maintained in 1987, status inactive. The property at the end of the road was listed as a parcel owned by an estate that had been in probate since 1991. The owner deceased, no heirs identified. The property description noting a dwelling structure, condition unknown. I've driven past that fork every Tuesday and Thursday since November of 2022. The left fork is there, the road climbing away from the creek into the forest, the pavement visible for maybe 50 yards before the curve takes it out of sight. No detour sign, no barrier, no utility equipment. The road looking exactly the way it has looked for 17 years. An abandoned fork that leads to an abandoned property at the end of a road that nobody drives. But I looked at the left fork differently now. I looked at it the way you look at a door that you've always assumed was locked, and that you discovered, one afternoon, was open. The road is there. The structure at the end of it is there. Whatever I saw in that clearing, the house that was built wrong, the door that was too tall and too narrow, the windows at heights that didn't serve any human interior, all of it is still there, at the end of a road that a detour sign directed me to take on a November morning, and that I have not taken since. And I think about the detour sign, the standard DOT formatting, the proper installation, the official appearance of a sign that looked like it belonged there, and that directed traffic with the authority of a government agency. Something put that sign at the fork. Something wanted traffic directed up the left road. Something wanted whoever was driving through Dry Run on that November morning to follow the detour and to take the left fork and to drive up the deteriorating road through the dense forest to the clearing where the wrong house sat with its too tall door and its misplaced windows and its threshold that met the mud without a porch or a step or any of the elements that say human dwelling. Something wanted me to go there, and the sign was the lure. And I went. I followed the sign and I drove to the clearing and I saw the house and I turned around and I came back and the sign was gone and the road was clear and everything was normal. But I wonder about the days when I'm not on the route, the days when a different driver covers my Tuesday-Thursday loop because I'm on vacation or I'm sick or I've taken a personal day. I wonder if the sign appears on those days, for those drivers, directing them up the left fork the way it directed me. I wonder if anyone has followed it and not come back. And I wonder about the house, the door that was 8 feet tall and 2 feet wide, the windows at wrong heights, the structure that looked like a house, the way a trap looks like shelter, the form of the thing it's mimicking without the function of the thing it's mimicking. I don't take the left fork. I drive past it every Tuesday and Thursday, and I look at the road climbing into the forest, and I keep my eyes on the right fork, and I deliver the mail, and I don't stop. But the left fork is there, and the road is there, and the house, at the end of it, is there, waiting for the next detour sign, and the next driver who follows it. I've been driving a school bus in McDowell County, West Virginia, for 14 years, which means I've spent 14 years navigating roads that the rest of the state has largely forgotten exist. McDowell County is the poorest county in West Virginia, which makes it one of the poorest places in the United States, a fact that manifests in the roads, the way it manifests in everything else. The pavement cracked and patched and narrowed by erosion, the shoulders crumbling into the hollows, the bridges posted with weight limits that my bus technically exceeds, and that everyone ignores, because the alternative is a 30-mile detour through terrain that would add an hour to a route that already takes too long. The county has lost more than half its population since the coal industry collapsed, which means the roads I drive serve fewer families than they used to, and that the hollows where I make my stops are emptier than they were when I started. The houses thinning out as the young people leave and the old people die, and the mountains slowly reclaim the spaces that the coal economy briefly populated. My afternoon route is the longest in the district, 12 miles from the consolidated school to the last stop in a hollow called Trace Fork, a road that branches off the main valley and climbs through terrain so steep and so narrow that the bus barely fits between the hillside on one side and the creek on the other. The road serves maybe 8 families now, down from 15 when I started the route, the stops disappearing one by one as the houses empty, and the children graduate or transfer or simply stop showing up. The last stop is at the turnaround, a widened section of road at the end of the maintained pavement, where the county gave up trying to push the road further into the hollow, and where a flat area just big enough for a school bus to reverse direction marks the boundary between the road and the track that continues as gravel, and then dirt, and then nothing into the head of the hollow where nobody lives anymore. The child who gets off at the turnaround is a girl named Amber, 11 years old, who lives with her grandfather in a house about 200 yards past the turnaround on the gravel section. She's the last student on my route, the last face I see every afternoon before I turn the bus around and drive back down the hollow empty, the 12 miles of return trip that I make in the early dark of whatever season it is. The bus rattling through the narrow road with its lights on and its seats empty, and the particular quiet that a school bus produces when it's carrying no one. October of 2023, a Thursday. The sunset was coming early, the way October sunsets do in these hollows, where the ridges cut the light by 4 o'clock and the valley floor is in shadow, while the ridge tops still hold the last amber glow of a day that the hollow has already lost. I dropped Amber at the turnaround at about 4:15. She got off the bus with her backpack and walked up the gravel toward her grandfather's house, and I watched her until she reached the porch, which is what I do every day because she's 11, and the gravel section doesn't have streetlights, and watching her walk home is part of the job, whether the job description says so or not. I turned the bus around. The turnaround is tight, requiring a 3-point turn that puts the bus's bumper within inches of the ditch on one side and the hillside on the other, the particular geometry of reversing a 40-foot vehicle in a space designed for pickup trucks. I completed the turn and started back down the hollow, the headlights on, the heater running, the bus settling into the empty rhythm of the return trip, 12 miles of narrow road through a hollow that was already in full shadow and that would be in full dark before I reached the school. I'd been driving maybe a mile when I checked the mirror. Habit. 14 years of driving a bus installs the mirror check as an automatic behavior, the eyes flicking to the rectangular glass every few seconds to monitor what's behind you, the reflex operating below conscious thought. The mirror showed the road behind the bus, the pavement running back into the hollow, the tree lines on both sides converging to a point in the distance where the road curved. There were lights in the mirror. Behind me, maybe 100 yards back, 2 lights. My first thought was headlights, a vehicle that had entered the road behind me, someone from one of the houses I'd passed, a truck pulling out of a driveway and falling in behind the bus. This was normal. It happened several times a week. People following the bus down the hollow, waiting for the wider sections to pass, the slow parade of mountain traffic on a road too narrow for easy overtaking. But I'd been at the turnaround, the end of the road. I'd turned the bus around at the point where the maintained road ended, and I'd started back down the hollow, and in the mile between the turnaround and my current position, there were no driveways, no pull-offs, no side roads, no place where a vehicle could have entered the road behind me. The houses on this section of the route were all on the uphill side, their driveways connecting to the road at points that I'd already passed, behind me, between my current position and the turnaround. For a vehicle to be behind me, it would have had to enter the road from a point that didn't exist, materialize on the pavement in the mile of empty road between the turnaround and where I was now. I watched the lights in the mirror. They maintained their distance, 100 yards, steady, matching my speed, which was about 30 miles per hour. the appropriate speed for this road in this light. The lights were 2 points of illumination, circular, the shape that headlights make in a rearview mirror when they're far enough back that the beam pattern isn't distinguishable. But as I watched, the details accumulated into something that didn't match any vehicle I could identify. The lights were the wrong color. Headlights are white or blue-white, the color temperature of halogen or LED, or the older sealed beam incandescent that produces a warm white. These lights were yellow, not the yellow of fog lights, which is a specific amber designed to cut through moisture. A duller, yellow, warmer, the color of light produced by a source that wasn't electrical, that had the organic, uneven quality of flame rather than the steady output of a bulb. The color shifted slightly as I watched, the intensity fluctuating in a way that no automotive light system produces, the brightness varying by small degrees the way firelight varies, never steady, never constant. The lights were too far apart. I know what headlights look like in a bus mirror at 100 yards. I've seen them thousands of times. The spacing between the lights behind me was wider than any vehicle I'd ever seen, the gap between them suggesting a width that was greater than a full-size truck, greater than any vehicle that could fit on a road this narrow. If these were headlights, they were mounted on something that was wider than the road, and the lights didn't illuminate the road. This was the detail that shifted my confusion into something colder. Headlights produce a beam. The beam hits the road surface, and the road reflects the light, and the area between the vehicle and the observer is lit by the combination of direct and reflected illumination. The road between my bus and whatever was behind me was dark. The lights produced illumination, but the illumination stopped at the source, as if the light were self-contained, visible as 2 points but not extending beyond them, not reaching the pavement, not projecting a beam that a vehicle's headlights would project. The lights existed as light without illuminating anything around them. I slowed the bus. Instinct, the driver's reflex of adjusting speed when something behind you is registering as unusual. I dropped from 30 to 25. The lights dropped with me. The spacing remained constant, 100 yards, the lights matching my deceleration with the instantaneous precision that suggested not a vehicle responding to my speed change, but something that was maintaining a fixed distance regardless of my speed. I accelerated. Back to 30, then 35, then 40, which was faster than I should have been driving on this road but which the test required. The lights kept pace, 100 yards. Exactly. The distance fixed, the lights matching every speed change without the lag that a following vehicle produces, the delay of a driver processing the speed change of the vehicle ahead and adjusting their own speed accordingly. No lag, no variation. The lights behind me maintained their distance with the mechanical precision of something that was tethered to my bus by an invisible connection that was exactly 100 yards long. I drove. I kept my eyes on the road and on the mirror, alternating between the pavement ahead and the lights behind, the hollow narrowing and widening as the road followed the creek, the curves forcing me to focus on the driving, while the straight sections gave me time to watch the mirror. The lights followed every curve. They appeared in the mirror after every turn, with the same spacing and the same color and the same absence of road illumination, the yellow points tracking through the hollow behind me with the patient constancy of something that had decided to follow and that was not going to stop. 11 miles. 11 miles of driving through an October hollow with yellow lights in my mirror that matched my speed and maintained their distance and that produced light that didn't land on the road. 11 miles of the particular tension that builds when you're alone in a vehicle and something is behind you and you can't identify it and you can't outrun it because you've already tried. And the distance doesn't change. At the mouth of the hollow, where Trace Fork met the main valley road, I turned right toward the school. The road widened. The streetlights of the small community at the junction added their orange glow to the evening. I checked the mirror. The lights were gone. Not fading with distance, not turning off, not turning down a side road. Gone. The mirror showed the road behind me, the junction, the mouth of the hollow, the darkness of Trace Fork receding behind me, and no lights. No yellow points, no illumination, no indication that anything had been following me for 11 miles through a hollow that was now behind me, and that held whatever it held in the particular darkness that mountain hollows hold after the sun goes down. I pulled into the school parking lot and stopped the bus and sat in the driver's seat with the engine running and my hands on the wheel, and I looked in the mirror and the mirror showed nothing, and I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, Before I could make myself turn off the engine and get out, I told one person. The other bus driver who runs the route that parallels mine, a woman named Donna, who's been driving in McDowell County longer than I have, and who knows these hollows with an intimacy that comes from decades of driving children through them. I described the lights without embellishment, the color and the spacing and the fixed distance, and the way they didn't illuminate the road. She was quiet, the quiet of someone who is not surprised. She said she'd seen them, not the same night, not the same hollow, but the same lights. Yellow, circular, too far apart, producing light that didn't land on anything. She said she'd seen them twice in the 14 years she'd been driving her route, both times in the fall, both times in hollows that dead-ended in the mountains, both times on the return trip when the bus was empty. She said the old drivers, the ones who'd been running routes in McDowell County before her, had a name for them. She said they called them the followers. She said they showed up in the hollows in the fall, behind vehicles that were leaving, always behind, always at the same distance, always matching the speed, and that they stopped at the mouth of the hollow and didn't come out. She said the old drivers had a rule: don't stop, don't slow down, don't turn around. Drive out of the hollow and the lights will stop at the boundary, and whatever they are will stay in the hollow where they belong. I asked her what they were. She looked at me with the expression of a woman who has been driving school buses in McDowell County for 20 years and who has seen things that the routes produce and that the training doesn't cover. She said she didn't know. She said nobody knew. She said the hollows in McDowell County held things that the modern world hadn't cataloged and that the old world hadn't explained, and that the bus drivers learned about the same way they learned about the road conditions and the problem driveways and the families that needed extra patience, through experience and through the institutional knowledge that one driver passes to the next. Don't stop, don't slow down, don't turn around. Drive out of the hollow and the lights will stop at the mouth. I've seen them one more time since. November of 2023, a different hollow, the same lights. Yellow, circular, too wide, the light that doesn't illuminate. 100 yards behind me, matching my speed, following me down the hollow, and stopping at the mouth where the hollow met the valley. I didn't slow down, I didn't stop. I drove out of the hollow and the light stayed behind and the mirror showed nothing, and I drove to the school and parked the bus and went home. And every afternoon, when I drop the last student and turn the bus around at the end of whatever hollow the route takes me to, I check the mirror before I start the drive back. I check it at the turnaround, and I check it at every straight section, and I watch for the yellow lights that appear in hollows in the fall, behind empty school buses, driven by people who are leaving. The followers, that's what the old drivers called them. The things that follow you out of the hollows and that stop at the boundary and that don't cross into the valley. They follow, and they stop. And the hollows hold them the way the hollows hold everything. In the dark, behind the buses, at the fixed distance that never changes. Waiting for the fall and the empty roads and the drivers who come to the end of the pavement and turn around and head back through the dark with something behind them that produces light that doesn't land on anything and that watches from a distance that it will not close. My wife Sarah and I make the drive from our home in Abingdon to her mother's house in Wise County about once a month, a visit that the geography of Southwest Virginia turns into an event rather than an errand, the route winding through the mountains on secondary highways that add time, but that we prefer to the interstate because the interstate means driving to Kingsport and then back up through the Gap and adding 40 minutes of Tennessee highway to what should be a Virginia trip. The mountain route is longer in miles but shorter in time and more familiar, the two-lane roads following the river valleys and crossing the ridges through terrain that Sarah grew up in and that I've learned over 12 years of marriage. The particular landscape of the Virginia coalfields, where the mountains are steep and the hollows are narrow, and the towns sit in the valleys like beads on a string, connected by the highway that is the only route through. We'd spent the afternoon and evening with her mother, the usual visit, dinner and conversation, and the gradual winding down that family visits produce, until you look at the clock and realize you've stayed later than intended, and the drive home is going to be a dark one. We left around 10:30, which put us on the road at the hour when the secondary highways in this part of Virginia empty out, the local traffic gone, the coal trucks parked for the night, the road belonging to whoever is on it, and to the darkness that fills the spaces between the towns. The route from Wise to Abingdon follows a series of state highways that connect the small towns strung along the valleys. the road climbing over ridges and descending into hollows in a rhythm that becomes hypnotic on a dark night. The headlights illuminating the road ahead in a tunnel of light that moves with you, while the darkness remains fixed on both sides. Between the towns, the road is empty. Not empty the way a highway is empty at night, where the road itself is illuminated by its own infrastructure, the lane markings and the reflectors and the interchange lighting, creating a sense of maintained space even when no other vehicles are present. Empty the way mountain roads are empty, the pavement, a narrow strip of human intention running through terrain that exists independently of the road, and that the darkness returns to its natural state the moment the headlights pass. Sarah was in the passenger seat, her phone in her lap, not looking at it because cell service on this route is intermittent at best, and because she'd learned years ago that the mountain drive required attention not from the driver alone but from both occupants, an extra set of eyes for the deer that materialized at road edges and the curves that tightened unexpectedly, and the general awareness that mountain driving at night demands. We were between towns, maybe 15 miles from Wise and 20 from the next community, on a stretch of highway that followed a creek through a hollow, the road straight enough in places to see a few hundred yards ahead, the forest dark on both sides, the occasional house visible as a porch light set back from the road. The time was approximately 11 o'clock. I saw the first figure at an intersection where a side road met the highway from the right. The side road was a county road, one lane, gravel, the kind of road that leads to a handful of houses up a hollow, and that meets the highway at a 90-degree angle, with a stop sign that nobody needs, because the traffic on the side road is measured in vehicles per day, rather than per hour. The intersection was unremarkable, one of dozens along the route, the kind of junction you pass without noticing because there's nothing to notice, except that someone was standing there. At the edge of the intersection, on the right side of the highway where the side road met the main road, a figure was standing, not on the road surface, not in the travel lane, not positioned as if waiting to cross or flagging down a vehicle. Standing at the margin where the gravel shoulder met the grass, motionless, facing the highway, the posture of someone who was watching the road rather than waiting to use it. The figure was at the outer edge of what my headlights could illuminate, the beam catching the shape but not the detail, the light arriving with enough strength to confirm that something was there, but not enough to tell me what it was, beyond the basic outline of an upright human form. I said to Sarah, "There's someone standing at that intersection." The observation delivered in the casual tone of a driver, noting something unusual but not alarming. The kind of comment you make when you see something on a night drive that registers as odd but not threatening. Sarah looked. She saw it. She said, "Huh?" and we passed, and I checked the rearview mirror and the figure was still there, still facing the road, still motionless, a dark shape at the edge of the intersection, diminishing in the mirror as the distance increased. 2 miles later, another intersection, another side road meeting the highway, another junction where a gravel road emerged from a hollow and terminated at the state route, and another figure, standing at the edge, at the margin where shoulder met grass, facing the highway, motionless, in the same posture and the same position relative to the road as the first one. I didn't say anything this time. I didn't need to. Sarah saw it at the same moment I did, the figure appearing in the headlights with the same characteristics as the first, an upright human form at the edge of an intersection, watching the road, making no movement and no gesture, and showing no sign of any intention other than standing and watching. The third one was a mile and a half further. Same intersection type, same position, same posture. I slowed the truck slightly, not consciously, the deceleration produced by a body that was beginning to process the repetition as a pattern rather than a coincidence. Sarah said, "That's 3, and her voice had changed. The casual observation of the first sighting replaced by the careful, controlled tone of a woman who is noting something that she doesn't want to be noting. The fourth figure was at a fork where a secondary road branched off the highway and climbed a ridge. Standing at the fork, at the point where the roads diverged, facing the highway, motionless. The same silhouette, the same stance, the same positioning at the outer reach of the headlights where the shape was clear but the details were not. I was watching more carefully now, trying to extract information from the brief seconds that each figure was illuminated, trying to determine size, clothing, any distinguishing feature that would help me categorize what I was seeing as a person or a group of people or anything that had a rational explanation. The figures were human-sized, approximately average height, and they stood with an evenness of posture that was itself unusual, the perfect stillness of their bodies, suggesting not someone who was standing naturally, but someone who was standing with intention, the deliberate immobility of something that was maintaining a position rather than merely occupying one. Sarah stopped talking after the fourth one. She sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and her eyes forward, and she counted, which I knew because she told me later, silently, keeping track with the focused attention of someone who needed the counting to anchor her to something concrete while the experience unfolded around us. The fifth, a T intersection where a hollow road met the highway, the figure standing at the junction on the right side, facing us as we approached, the headlights catching the shape and illuminating it for the 3 or 4 seconds that it took to drive past at 50 miles per hour. I was watching the figure in my peripheral vision as we passed, looking for any movement, any turn of the head, any response to our vehicle's passage. Nothing. The figure stood at the intersection and faced the road and did not move as we approached, and did not move as we passed, and did not move in the rearview mirror as we drove away. The sixth, a crossroads, 4 ways. The highway crossing another road in a small cleared area where a closed gas station sat dark and empty on one corner. The figure was on the opposite corner from the gas station, standing at the edge of the intersection, same posture, same position, same motionless orientation toward the highway. The gas station was closed, the lights off, the pumps dark. The figure stood on the gravel in front of nothing, at a crossroads in the dark, watching the road. The seventh was the last. An intersection about 3 miles before the next town, where a side road came down off a ridge and met the highway at an angle. The figure was there, at the margin, facing the road, and we drove past in the silence that had settled over the truck after the 4th sighting, the silence of 2 people who have agreed without speaking to not discuss what is happening until it has finished happening. We entered the next town. Streetlights, houses, the lit windows of a gas station that was open late. The intersections in town were empty. The world was normal. The highway beyond the town was normal. We drove the remaining miles to Abingdon without seeing another figure. The intersections empty. The side roads meeting the highway with nothing standing at their edges. The mountain darkness holding nothing but itself. Sarah said 7. She said it when we were on the last stretch of road before home. The familiar terrain of our own county. The headlights showing the road we drove every day. 7 figures, 7 intersections, 20 miles of mountain highway. She said each one was in the same position. She said each one was the same size. She said none of them moved. We didn't discuss explanations that night. We were too tired and too unsettled and too aware that any explanation we constructed would be insufficient for what we'd both seen. People don't stand at 7 consecutive intersections on a mountain highway at 11 o'clock on a January night in identical postures facing the road. Groups don't coordinate that kind of positioning across 20 miles of highway without vehicles and without communication and without any visible purpose. Whatever explanation exists for 7 figures at 7 intersections is not an explanation that involves people doing things that people do. I've driven that stretch dozens of times since, day and night, alone and with Sarah, in every season and every weather condition. The intersections are empty. The side roads meet the highway with nothing standing at their edges. The junctions that held those figures on that January night are ordinary intersections on an ordinary mountain road, showing nothing unusual, holding no evidence that anything was ever there. I've asked around, carefully, the way you ask about things in small mountain communities where the wrong question makes you the wrong kind of person. The responses have been what I expected. Most people have nothing to say. A few have given me the look, the particular expression of mountain people who know what you're describing and who have decided that knowing is enough. One man, old, a lifelong resident of the county, listened to my description and nodded and said they've been seen before. He said they appear at the intersections on certain nights in winter, and that they watch the road, and that they don't interfere with anyone, and that they've been reported going back decades. The same pattern, figures at the junctions, motionless, facing the highway, present for one night and then gone. He said they're watchers. He said they stand at the intersections the way sentries stand at checkpoints, monitoring passage, noting who travels the road on nights when the watchers are posted. He said they don't stop anyone. They don't interact. They stand and they watch and they're gone by morning, and the intersections are empty and the road is a road again. I asked him who they are. He said he didn't know. He said nobody knows. He said the mountains have had watchers for as long as the mountains have had roads. The junctions monitored by things that stand at the edges and face the travelers and record their passage with whatever kind of attention the watchers employ. 7 figures, 7 intersections, 20 miles of Virginia mountain highway on a January night, standing at the margins where the side roads meet the highway, motionless, watching, positioned with a regularity that said purpose rather than coincidence. And then gone. The intersections empty, the road ordinary, the night returning to its normal darkness. But I check the intersections now. Every time I drive that stretch, day or night, I look at the junctions where the side roads meet the highway, and I look for the shapes at the margins. They haven't been there, not since January. But the man said they've been seen going back decades, which means they were there before that January night, and they'll be there again, standing at the intersections, watching the road, counting whatever they count when the travelers pass through their checkpoints on nights when the watchers decide to post themselves at the junctions and monitor the passage of whatever moves through these mountains in the dark. Sarah and I were counted. On a January night, on a mountain highway, at 7 intersections, something stood and watched us pass and noted our passage. And the question that keeps me awake is not what they are. The question is what they're counting, and why, and what happens when the count reaches whatever number the watchers are waiting for. I've been driving delivery routes through the mountains of eastern Kentucky for 8 years, working for a medical supply company that serves the rural clinics and pharmacies and small hospitals that provide healthcare to communities that the larger healthcare systems don't reach. The work is driving. That's the core of it. Hours behind the wheel, on roads that range from well-maintained state highways to county roads that the mapping applications treat as theoretical, the GPS showing a blue line where the satellite imagery shows a gravel track that may or may not be passable depending on the season and the weather, and the particular relationship between the county's road maintenance budget and the terrain's determination to reclaim what the graders have scraped. I know these roads. 8 years of driving the same routes to the same clinics has given me the kind of familiarity that operates below conscious navigation. The truck following the route the way your feet follow the path from your bedroom to your bathroom at 3 in the morning. The body, knowing the way without requiring the mind to participate. I know where the potholes are. I know which bridges have weight limits that my loaded truck approaches. I know the landmarks that confirm I'm on the right road and the turns that come up faster than you expect, and the stretches where the cell service drops and the GPS loses its mind and you navigate by memory because memory is more reliable than technology in mountains that were old when the first satellites were launched. The route to the clinic in Knott County was one of my regulars. A delivery every 2 weeks, medical supplies that the clinic couldn't get through their normal distribution channels because the normal channels didn't deliver to addresses that required an hour of mountain driving from the nearest interstate. The route followed a state highway up a river valley, through a series of small communities that existed as clusters of houses and churches, and the occasional store along the highway, the communities connected by the road that was their only link to each other and to the larger world. Between 2 of these communities, the highway crossed a bridge over a creek, a standard 2-lane concrete bridge that I'd crossed 100 times. And on the far side of the bridge, I took a right turn onto a county road that climbed away from the river valley and wound through the hills for about 4 miles to the clinic. The turn was marked by a road sign and by the particular cluster of landmarks that I'd memorized on my first trip and that I confirmed unconsciously every time: the bridge, the turn, the mailbox with the reflective numbers, the church with the white steeple visible on the hill above the road, the specific visual sequence that said you're on the right road and the clinic is 4 miles ahead. March of 2022, a Thursday, mid-afternoon, the weather overcast but not raining. The March landscape showing the first tentative signs of spring in the valley, the willows along the river yellowing, the hillside still brown and bare. The particular transitional state that March produces in these mountains, when winter has relaxed its grip but spring hasn't committed. I was running my regular route, the truck loaded with the clinic's bi-weekly supply order, the radio on, the drive unremarkable in every way that a routine drive is unremarkable. I crossed the bridge. I took the right turn. The road was there, the county road climbing away from the highway. The pavement, the same width and the same surface that I'd driven 50 times before. The turn felt normal. The first 100 yards felt normal. The truck climbed the initial grade that the county road always climbed after leaving the river valley, the engine working against the slope the way it always did, the road curving to the left the way it always curved, and then the road was wrong. I didn't register it immediately. The wrongness arrived not as a single dramatic change, but as an accumulation of small differences that my subconscious detected before my conscious mind assembled them into a pattern. The first thing I noticed was the church. The white steeple that was visible on the hill above the road within the first quarter mile of the turn, the landmark that I used to confirm I was on the correct road, was not there. The hill was there. The trees on the hill were there. But the church that had been standing on that hill for as long as I'd been driving this route was absent, the hillside showing only forest where a white clapboard church with a steeple should have been. I told myself I was mistaken, that the church was further up the road than I remembered, that the curves had repositioned my sightline, that the overcast sky was affecting my perception of distance and direction. I drove on. The road climbed, a quarter mile, a half mile, the road winding through terrain that was approximately correct in its general character, the forested hills and the narrow hollows and the occasional flat where a house might sit, the landscape of Knott County that I'd been driving through for years. But the houses were wrong. The houses that should have been along this road, the specific residences that I'd passed 50 times, and that I knew by their mailboxes and their vehicles, and the particular accumulation of objects that every mountain property displays, the firewood and the equipment and the children's toys and the dogs, those houses were not there. The places where houses should have been were empty, not demolished, not burned, not showing the evidence of structures that had been removed. Empty. The landscape showing no indication that anyone had ever built there. The terrain unbroken by driveways or clearings, or the flat spots that mountain builders create when they prepare a site for construction. I slowed the truck. The road continued to climb, and it was curving to the left in a long sweeping turn that I did not recognize. The road I knew curved to the right at this point, following the contour of a hollow that ran parallel to the route. This road was curving the wrong direction, climbing when it should have been level, bending left when it should have been bending right, and the further I drove, the more pronounced the divergence became. The road I was on separating from the road I knew with each tenth of a mile, the landscape outside my windows becoming less familiar with every curve until I was driving through terrain that I had never seen. The mountains were the same. The general character of the landscape, the steep forested slopes and the narrow valleys, and the particular quality of eastern Kentucky terrain was consistent with where I should have been. But the specific details were wrong. The configuration of the hills, the shape of the hollows, the way the ridges related to each other and to the road that wound between them, none of it matched any section of Knott County that I knew, and I knew Knott County well enough that an unfamiliar section of road should not have existed within 4 miles of a highway I'd driven hundreds of times. I checked my phone. No service, which was normal for this area. The GPS showed my position as a blue dot on a map that displayed the county road I should have been on, the route drawn in its correct configuration, the blue dot sitting squarely on the road that led to the clinic. According to the GPS, I was exactly where I should have been. According to my eyes, I was somewhere else entirely. I drove for 3 miles. 3 miles of road that my GPS said was the road I knew, and that my experience said was not. 3 miles of wrong curves and wrong grades, and absent landmarks, and a landscape that used the same pavement and the same lane width and the same road surface as the road I knew, but that existed in a different arrangement of terrain, a different configuration of hills and hollows that shared the general character of eastern Kentucky, but that did not share the specific geography that my 50 previous trips had established as reality. The wrongness intensified with distance. By the 3rd mile, the road had climbed higher than the road I knew ever climbed, reaching an elevation that put me above the surrounding hollows, the visibility opening up to show a vista of forested ridges that extended to the horizon in every direction, the Appalachian landscape at its most vast and most undifferentiated, miles of mountain terrain that looked like every other mile of mountain terrain, the particularity of specific places dissolved into the generality of the range. I could see no roads, no structures, no clearings, no sign of human presence in any direction, except the road beneath my tires and the truck that was carrying me through a landscape that should not have been accessible from a right turn off a state highway in Knott County. I stopped. The truck sat on the road at what my GPS said was mile 3 of the county road, the point where the clinic should have been visible ahead, the building and its parking lot, and the sign that said the clinic's name. The road ahead showed nothing but more road, climbing toward a ridge that I did not recognize, and that the county road I knew did not approach, because the county road I knew ran through a valley and did not climb ridges. I turned around. The turnaround was tight, the road narrow enough that I had to execute a 3-point turn, the truck's bumper coming close to the edge of the pavement where the road dropped off into a hollow that was deeper and steeper than any feature along the road I knew. I completed the turn and drove back the way I'd come, 3 miles of descent through the wrong landscape, the curves coming in reverse, the absent landmarks passing again, the terrain unwinding beneath my wheels as I retraced a route that I should never have been on. The bridge appeared, the state highway appeared, the river valley appeared, the familiar landscape of the main route reassembling itself as I descended from whatever elevation the wrong road had taken me to. I crossed the bridge and pulled over and sat in the truck and breathed and looked at the right turn that I had taken, the county road climbing away from the highway, and I could see the church, the white steeple on the hill above the road, visible from the highway, present and real and exactly where it had been every other time I'd driven this route. I took the turn again. The road climbed. The church was there. The mailbox with the reflective numbers was there. The houses were there, each one in its familiar position with its familiar vehicles and its familiar accumulation of property. The road curved right where it should curve right and leveled where it should level, and the clinic appeared at mile 4, exactly where it always appeared, and I made my delivery with hands that were not steady and a mind that was not processing anything except the mechanical routine of unloading boxes and checking invoices and performing the normal functions of a job that had just become the framework holding me together, while something fundamental about my understanding of roads and geography and the fixedness of physical terrain reorganized itself around the experience of driving 3 miles through a version of the landscape that was not the version I knew. I've driven that route many times since. The road goes where it should go, every time. The church is there. The houses are there. The curves curve correctly. The clinic appears at mile 4. Everything is as it has always been, and as it was when I took the turn the second time on that March afternoon. But it wasn't the first time. The first time, the road went somewhere else. The same pavement, the same lane width, the same initial grade, and then different curves, different elevations, different terrain, a landscape that existed on the other side of the same right turn, and that was accessible for 3 miles on a March afternoon, before I turned around and drove back to the bridge and took the turn again and found the world I knew waiting where I'd left it. I don't know where I was. I've looked at maps and satellite imagery and topographical surveys of Knott County, and I cannot find the terrain I drove through. The ridges I saw from the high point of the wrong road don't correspond to any vista visible from any road in the county. The hollow where I turned around doesn't exist in the elevation data. The climbing, left-curving road that diverged from the route I knew is not on any map because it's not in any landscape that the maps describe. For 3 miles on a March afternoon, I drove through a place that isn't on the map, a place that shared the pavement and the starting point of the road I knew, but that diverged from it curve by curve and mile by mile into terrain that I cannot locate and that I have never found again. The road went somewhere it shouldn't, and I followed it for 3 miles before the wrongness exceeded what I could accommodate, and I turned around. And the question I keep coming back to is not where the road went. The question is what was at the end of it. What was at mile 4, at the point where the clinic should have been, on the road that climbed toward a ridge that doesn't exist in the geography of Knott County, Kentucky. What was waiting at the end of a road that looks like the right road and goes to the wrong place. I turned around at mile 3. I'll never know what was at mile 4. And I think that might be the only reason I'm still making deliveries on a route that I drive with my hands tight on the wheel and my eyes on the church steeple, confirming that the world is the world I know every time I take that right turn off the bridge and start the climb. The church is always there now, but I check every time, because once it wasn't. I fish at night because the night is when the water belongs to whoever is willing to be in it, which in the mountains of western North Carolina means it belongs to me and to the trout and to whatever else occupies the creek corridors after the daylight fishermen have gone home and the hollows have returned to the state they exist in for most of their hours. dark and quiet and operating on rules that the daytime doesn't fully apply. I've been night fishing for 23 years, which is long enough to have developed a relationship with darkness that most people would find uncomfortable and that I find essential. The absence of light not as deprivation but as medium, the way water is a medium for the fish, the element that enables a particular kind of experience that cannot exist in any other condition. The trout streams of western North Carolina are fed by the mountains, the cold water running off the Blue Ridge and the Great Smokies through drainages that are steep and narrow and forested to the water's edge, the canopy closing over the creeks in summer to create tunnels of shade that keep the water temperature viable for trout in a latitude that should be too far south for them. The fish are wild in most of these streams, natives and naturalized browns that have been reproducing in these waters for generations, and that behave differently from stocked fish, more cautious, more responsive to pressure, more likely to feed under conditions of low light, when the energy cost of the caution that daylight requires is offset by the reduced visibility that darkness provides. Night fishing targets these fish in their most active state, the hours when they move from the holding lies where they spend the day into the riffles and the pools where they feed aggressively in the dark. I fish alone. This is not bravado, not a statement of toughness or independence. It's a requirement of the practice. Night fishing demands a focus that conversation disrupts, a sensitivity to sound and movement that another person's presence overwhelms. The fish respond to vibration. They feel your steps through the substrate of the creek bed. They hear your voice in the water that conducts sound with a fidelity that air doesn't match. Fishing alone at night is not about being alone. It's about being quiet enough that the creek forgets you're there. The creek in Haywood County was one I'd been fishing for about 6 years. A freestone stream that ran through a hollow, accessible by a trail that followed the creek upstream from a county road. The fishing was good, the water holding a population of wild brown trout that had adapted to the particular conditions of this drainage and that fed actively at night in the pools and riffles that the creek's gradient produced. I knew the creek well, the particular features of each pool and run, the structure where the fish held, the approach routes that allowed me to reach the water without spooking the fish that I was there to catch. The access required crossing a bridge, an old wooden structure, single lane, built maybe in the 1950s based on the construction that had been the only crossing at this point on the creek, until the county built a new concrete bridge 50 yards downstream in the 1990s. The old bridge remained, maintained minimally, serving as a foot crossing for the handful of people who used the trail on the far side, hikers and fishermen, and the occasional hunter who accessed the ridges above the hollow through a path that started at the bridge and climbed the slope. The bridge was maybe 40 feet long, wooden plank surface, wooden railings on both sides, the structure weathered to the gray that untreated lumber achieves after decades of mountain weather, the boards worn smooth by the traffic that had crossed them for 60 years. November of 2021. A Wednesday night, the second week of the month, the air cold enough that my breath was visible in the moonlight and that the creek water, when I waded into it later, would produce the particular aching cold that November trout water delivers through neoprene waders and wool socks, and the layers of insulation that separate a fisherman's skin from water that is running in the low 40s. I parked at the pull-off where the county road met the trail and geared up in the dark, assembling my rod by feel, the muscle memory of 23 years of rigging in the dark making the process automatic, the fingers finding the ferrules and the guides in the line without the assistance of eyes that were better used adapting to the moonlight. I kept my headlamp off. This was practice rather than necessity, the habit of a night fisherman who knows that headlamp light destroys the dark adaptation that the eyes have been building since the drive, and that spooks fish in the pools near the trail, the trout detecting the moving beam of light through the canopy in the water, and responding with the caution that any change in their environment produces. The moon was half, waxing, providing enough illumination through the leafless November canopy to navigate the trail, the path visible as a lighter strip against the darker ground of the forest floor, the creek audible to my left as I walked upstream toward the bridge. The trail followed the creek for about a quarter mile before reaching the bridge. The walking was familiar, the terrain committed to memory by 6 years of nighttime approaches, my feet finding the roots and the rocks and the muddy sections without conscious guidance, the body navigating the trail, the way the body navigates any route it has traveled hundreds of times. The creek ran beside me, the sound constant, the particular voice of this creek in November, lower than the summer voice, the flow reduced by the seasonal decrease in precipitation, the water running clear and cold over the stones with the steady murmur that mountain creeks maintain year-round. I saw the bridge from about 50 yards away, the structure visible as a dark horizontal line crossing the lighter surface of the creek, the wooden railings and the plank surface showing as geometry against the organic shapes of the water and the banks. The moonlight was sufficient to show the bridge clearly at this distance, the half-moon above the ridge providing the pale, cool illumination that I navigated by, the light catching the water beneath the bridge and showing it as a ribbon of silver gray running between the dark banks. Something was on the bridge. Standing at the center of the span, leaning against the railing on the downstream side, positioned the way a person leans on a bridge railing when they're looking at the water below, the upper body tilted forward, the weight resting on the forearms, the posture of someone who has stopped in the middle of a crossing to watch the creek pass beneath them. The shape was human-sized and human-shaped, the silhouette showing head and shoulders and the upper body angled over the railing. The particular pose that bridge railings invite and that people adopt unconsciously when they stop on a bridge and look down. I stopped on the trail. The shape was clear enough in the moonlight to be certain that something was there, a form at the center of the bridge that was not part of the bridge's structure and that had the outline of a person. I could not determine details. The moonlight provided shape but not specificity, the outline clear, the features invisible. I couldn't see clothing or skin color, or whether the figure was facing upstream or downstream. I could see the posture, the lean against the railing, the angle of the body, the particular relaxation that the pose conveyed, the look of someone who was comfortable on this bridge, who had leaned on this railing before, who was not a visitor but a presence. I called out, "Hey there," the standard greeting of one outdoorsman to another on a trail at night, delivered with the particular projected friendliness that you use when you encounter someone unexpectedly in the dark and when you want to establish that you are not a threat and that you expect the same courtesy. My voice carried across the 50 yards of trail and creek with the clarity that cold November air provides, the sound reaching the bridge and the figure on it without distortion. No response. The figure did not move, did not turn toward my voice, did not straighten from its lean against the railing, did not produce any sound or motion that indicated it had heard me or was aware of my presence. It remained in its position, leaning on the railing, looking at the water, as motionless as it had been when I first saw it. I called again, louder, the volume carrying a note of insistence that the first call hadn't contained, the tone of someone who needs a response and who is prepared to be concerned if they don't get one. The sound went out across the creek bottom, and the bridge absorbed it the way bridges absorb sound, the wooden structure resonating slightly, with the vibration of a voice directed at it. Nothing. The figure remained at the railing, motionless, leaning, looking down at the water with the fixed attention of something that was either ignoring me or that was not equipped to respond. The stillness absolute, not the stillness of a person who is choosing not to answer, but the stillness of something that exists in a state where answering is not among its capabilities. I reached for my headlamp. The switch was at my temple, the button familiar under my finger, and I pressed it with the expectation that the beam would illuminate the bridge and the figure and would convert the moonlit silhouette into a person, someone with a face and clothes and an explanation for standing on a bridge at midnight in November, in a hollow that nobody used after dark. The beam hit the bridge. The LED threw a cone of white light that traveled the 50 yards from the trail to the span and illuminated the wooden surface and the railings and the water below, with the harsh clarity that artificial light imposes on darkness. The bridge was empty. Not empty as in the figure had stepped off. Not empty as in someone had moved quickly enough in the fraction of a second between my pressing the switch and the beam reaching the bridge to exit the span and disappear into the darkness on either side. Empty as in nothing was there. The plank surface showed only weathered wood, and the railing showed only weathered posts, and the center of the span where the figure had been leaning was vacant, the space unoccupied, the bridge holding nothing but itself, and the moonlight, and the sound of the creek running beneath it. I stood on the trail with my headlamp on, and I scanned the bridge and the banks on both sides, and the trail beyond, and found nothing. No figure on the banks, no movement in the vegetation, no sound of footsteps departing, no disturbance of any kind that would indicate a person had been on the bridge and had left in the second that the light took to reach them. The bridge was empty, the way a stage is empty when the performance is over, and the performer has departed not through the wings, but through some exit that the audience cannot see. I walk to the bridge. 50 yards of trail, my headlamp on, my senses amplified by the particular alertness that the experience had produced, the body processing every sound and every shadow, with the heightened attention of an organism that has encountered something it cannot explain. I reached the bridge and stepped onto the planks and walked to the center, to the point where the figure had been standing, where the downstream railing bore the posture that I had seen clearly in the moonlight, the lean of a body against the wood. I turned off the headlamp. I stood at the railing and I looked at the bridge in the moonlight, and it was a bridge, wooden and old and gray, the surface showing the wear of decades of feet and weather. Nothing was on it except me. The creek ran below. The moonlight showed the water and the banks and the trail on both sides, disappearing into the November darkness. I put my hand on the railing, the specific section of railing where the figure had been leaning, the downstream side, the spot that corresponded to the posture I had observed from the trail. The wood was warm, not the ambient temperature that November night would have produced on weathered lumber, which was in the low 30s, and which the wood should have matched. Warm. The particular warmth of wood that has absorbed heat from a living body, the way a chair seat is warm after someone has been sitting in it, the way a doorknob is warm after someone has been holding it. The railing was warm with the residual heat of contact, the thermal signature of a body that had been leaning against this wood, and that had transferred its warmth into the grain, and that had departed, leaving nothing but the temperature behind. I fished. I crossed the bridge and followed the trail to the creek, and waded in and fished for 3 hours, and caught 4 brown trout and released them all, and did not think about the bridge because thinking about the bridge required processing information that I was not ready to process at midnight while standing alone in a creek in a hollow that was dark and cold, and that held, somewhere in its length, a bridge where something leaned against a railing and watched the water and was warm. I crossed the bridge again at 3 in the morning, heading back to the truck. The bridge was empty. The moonlight showed it clearly, the planks and the railings and the nothing that occupied them. I touched the railing as I passed. Cold. The wood at air temperature, the warmth gone, the thermal memory of whatever had been leaning there dissipated into the November night. I've been back. Many times, the creek still fishable, the bridge still standing, the hollow still producing the wild brown trout that brought me there in the first place. I crossed the bridge on every trip, usually at night, usually with my headlamp off, usually in the moonlight that shows the span and the railings and the water below. I've seen it twice more. The figure at the railing, leaning, looking at the water. Both times at night, both times in the moonlight, both times in the pose that says someone standing on a bridge watching the creek. Both times I've turned on my headlamp and the bridge has been empty and the railing has been warm. I don't call out anymore. There's no point. Whatever stands on that bridge doesn't respond to voices and doesn't need to be greeted and doesn't leave when the light arrives, because it doesn't leave through space but through some other dimension that light doesn't apply to. It simply stops being visible when the headlamp activates, the way a shadow stops being visible when you shine a light on it, not because the shadow has moved, but because the conditions that produced it have changed. Someone leans on the railing of that bridge and watches the creek at night, someone who was warm, someone who stood on wood that absorbed their heat and held it after they were gone. Someone who watches the water the way people have watched water from bridges since bridges were built. The particular contemplation that moving water invites, the meditation of flowing time observed from a fixed point. I don't know who. I don't know what. I know the railing is warm where they lean. I know the moonlight shows them and the headlamp doesn't. I know they watch the water with the patience of something that has been watching it for a very long time. And I fish. And I cross the bridge. And some nights the railing is warm and some nights it's cold, and the difference tells me whether I'm alone in the hollow or whether someone is watching the water from the bridge while I cast my flies into the pools below. The two of us occupying the same creek on the same November night, the fisherman and the figure, separated by whatever distance separates the visible from the invisible. And the creek runs, and the bridge stands. And some nights, in the moonlight, someone leans on the railing and looks at the water, and the wood remembers. I drive the back roads of Mingo County at hours that most people consider unreasonable, because my job requires it, and because, after 8 years of running parts between the auto salvage yards that operate in the hollows of southern West Virginia and the shops and dealers that buy from them, the unreasonable hours have become the normal hours, The 2 a.m. runs as routine as a commuter's morning drive. The economics of the salvage business favor night transport. The yards operate during the day, pulling parts and processing inventory, and the drivers who move the parts between yards and buyers run at night when the roads are empty and the loads can move without the interference of daytime traffic on roads that are barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass in daylight, and that at night belong to whoever is on them. Mingo County is the deep south of West Virginia, the coalfield county that sits on the Kentucky border and that contains some of the most remote terrain in the state, the hollows running deep and narrow between ridges that climb to 2,000 feet. The roads following the creek bottoms through valleys that are barely wider than the pavement and the creek and the strip of flat ground between them. The towns are small and far apart. The communities that the coal industry built and that the coal industry's decline has been slowly emptying for decades, the population decreasing as the young people leave and the old people age and the houses on the hillsides go dark one by one. Between the towns, the hollows are empty, the roads running through forest that has reclaimed the slopes since the last timber cut and that presses close to the pavement with the particular density of second-growth Appalachian hardwood, thick and dark and continuous. The shortcut through the hollow was a route I'd been using for about 3 years, a county road that connected two state highways through a hollow that saved approximately 20 minutes compared to the main route. The road was paved but narrow, following a creek through a valley that was maybe a quarter-mile wide at its broadest, and that narrowed in places to barely enough room for the road and the creek side by side. There were a few houses in the first mile, dark at 2 a.m., the residents sleeping, the porches showing the occasional light that rural people leave on through the night. After the first mile, the houses ended, and the hollow continued for about 4 more miles through uninhabited forest, the road climbing slightly as the creek drainage narrowed, the terrain steep on both sides, the forest dark and close. December of 2022. A Thursday night, technically Friday morning, the temperature in the teens, the kind of December cold that the West Virginia mountains produce, when the high-pressure systems settle over the Appalachian Plateau, and the air goes dry and still, and the cold deepens without the moderating influence of clouds or wind. I was running a load of transmission parts from a yard near Williamson to a shop in Logan, the route taking me through the hollow shortcut, the truck loaded, the road empty, the night clear and cold with the particular clarity that sub-20-degree air provides, the stars visible through the windshield with the brightness that clean cold air produces. I entered the hollow at approximately 2 a.m. The first mile passed normally, the dark houses on both sides, the porch lights, the creek running beside the road, the familiar terrain of a route I'd driven hundreds of times. The houses ended, and the hollow opened into its uninhabited middle section, the road running through forest, the headlights showing pavement and shoulder and tree line, and nothing else. 3 miles into the hollow, I saw the car. It was parked on the right shoulder, a sedan, dark-colored, positioned with the neat parallel alignment of a vehicle that had been deliberately parked rather than pulled over in haste. The engine was running. I could see the exhaust, a plume of white vapor rising from the tailpipe into the cold air, visible in my headlights as the condensed moisture of combustion meeting sub-20-degree atmosphere. The headlights were on, the low beams illuminating a section of road ahead of the parked car, the light reaching maybe 50 feet before it dissolved into the darkness of the hollow. The interior of the car was dark, no dome light, no dashboard glow beyond what the instrument panel would produce, no visible occupant. I registered it and drove past. A running car on a shoulder at 2 a.m. could mean many things. A driver who'd pulled over to check a phone, a couple who'd found a private spot, a person sleeping off something they shouldn't have been driving on. None of these were my business. The etiquette of late-night driving in Mingo County is straightforward. You don't stop for vehicles that aren't displaying distress signals, and you don't investigate situations that haven't asked for your investigation. I passed the car at my normal speed and continued through the hollow. 1 mile later, I passed another car. Same shoulder, right side, same sedan, same dark color, same parallel alignment. Engine running, exhaust visible, headlights on, interior dark. I process this with the delayed recognition of someone who has seen something once and is seeing it again, and whose brain is working to determine whether the repetition is coincidence or pattern. 2 cars of the same type on the same road was not impossible. It was unusual at 2 a.m. in an uninhabited hollow, but not impossible. I slowed, not consciously, not as a decision, but as the automatic response of a body that was beginning to classify the situation differently than the mind was classifying it. The deceleration produced by a nervous system that had shifted from the relaxed alertness of routine driving to the heightened awareness of something that didn't fit the pattern of a normal night run. I looked at the car more carefully as I passed. The make and model appeared identical to the first one. The color was the same dark tone, black or very dark blue, impossible to determine precisely in headlights. The exhaust rose from the tailpipe with the same steady plume. The headlights illuminated the same 50 feet of road ahead. The interior was the same uniform darkness. I checked my mirror after passing. The car sat on the shoulder behind me, its headlights visible in my rear view, the red of my taillights reflecting off its surface as I pulled away. It did not move. No doors opened, no lights came on. The car sat and ran and showed no evidence of occupancy beyond the engine that was turning and the lights that were lit. 1 mile later, the third car. Same shoulder, same sedan, same color, same alignment, same running engine, same exhaust plume, same headlights, same dark interior. Parked at the right edge of the road with the precision of the first two, the spacing from the second car identical to the spacing between the first and second. 1 mile, the regularity of the intervals destroying any remaining possibility that what I was seeing was coincidental. 3 identical cars, parked at 1 mile intervals on the shoulder of a road in an uninhabited hollow at 2 in the morning in December. All of them running, all of them lit, all of them apparently empty. Positioned with a regularity that was deliberate and purposeful, the spacing and the alignment and the identical presentation of each vehicle, communicating something that my conscious mind refused to interpret, but that my body was interpreting with increasing urgency, the hands tightening on the wheel, the foot pressing the accelerator harder, the eyes scanning the road ahead with the particular intensity of someone who needs the road to end, who needs the hollow to open into the highway and the normal world. I did not stop. I need to say this clearly because the question that people ask when I tell this story is always, why didn't you stop and look? And the answer is that stopping was not something my body was going to allow. Whatever system governs the decision to investigate versus the decision to flee had made its determination without consulting my rational mind. And the determination was to drive, to maintain speed, to put distance between myself and the 3 identical cars that were parked in the dark behind me, with their engines running and their headlights on and their interiors holding whatever their interiors held. The remaining 2 miles of the hollow were the longest 2 miles I've ever driven. I watched the shoulders with the desperate attention of someone who expected to see a 4th car and a 5th and a 6th. The pattern continuing, the hollow lined with identical sedans at mile intervals like markers on a course, delineating a route through the dark for a purpose that I could not imagine and that I did not want to imagine. No more cars appeared. The road climbed and the hollow narrowed, and the intersection with the state highway appeared in my headlights, and I turned onto the highway and drove maybe a 1/4 mile and pulled onto the shoulder and stopped. My hands were shaking. The particular tremor that adrenaline produces when the immediate threat has passed and the body releases the tension it's been holding, the fine vibration in the fingers that says your nervous system was prepared for something that didn't happen, and that the preparation came at a cost that the body is now paying. I sat in the truck on the highway shoulder with the engine running and the heater on, and I looked back toward the hollow entrance and I saw nothing. No headlights emerging from the hollow, no vehicles following me onto the highway. The hollow opening was dark and quiet, the county road disappearing into it the way all hollow roads disappear into the mountains, swallowed by the terrain and the forest and the darkness. I drove home. I made the delivery the next day using the main route, the extra 20 minutes a price I was willing to pay. And the following morning, Saturday, in daylight, I drove back through the hollow. The road was empty. The shoulders showed nothing. No tire marks, no compressed gravel, no oil stains, no evidence of any kind that a vehicle had been parked on any section of shoulder at any point in the recent past. The gravel was undisturbed, the dead grass at the road's edge intact, the shoulder showing the particular uniformity of a surface that has not been driven on or parked on, the natural state of a road margin that holds only the residue of weather and time. I stopped at each location. I knew the distances, the mile markers, the specific sections of shoulder where the 3 cars had been parked. At each location, I got out of the truck and examined the ground with the attention of someone who needs evidence and who is prepared to accept whatever the evidence says. The ground said nothing. No tire impressions in the gravel. No puddles of condensation beneath where tailpipes would have been producing exhaust. No disturbance of any kind. 3 cars that were running and lit and present on a December night had left no physical evidence that they had ever been there. I've asked around. The careful, oblique inquiries that you make in communities where direct questions about strange things mark you as either crazy or an outsider, and where neither label is useful. Most people have nothing to offer. One man, a driver who runs the same late-night routes I run, listened to my description and was quiet for a while, and then said he'd seen something similar. Not identical, not 3 cars, but a vehicle parked on a shoulder in a hollow at night that wasn't there in the morning and that left no marks. He said he'd seen it twice over 10 years and that he'd stopped using that particular hollow as a shortcut after the second time. He didn't have an explanation. He had the particular mountain pragmatism that substitutes avoidance for understanding, the practical decision to stop using a road rather than to understand why the road sometimes contains things that shouldn't be there and that leave no evidence of their presence. I don't use the hollow shortcut anymore. The 20 minutes I save aren't worth the possibility of driving through that stretch at 2 a.m. and seeing the cars again. The identical sedans parked at their mile intervals with their engines running and their headlights on and their interiors dark, posted in the hollow like markers or sentries, or the component parts of something that uses empty mountain roads at night for purposes that the daylight doesn't reveal and that the shoulder gravel doesn't record. 3 cars, running, lit, empty, spaced with the deliberate regularity of placement rather than parking. And in the morning, nothing. The hollow showing only road and shoulder and forest. The ordinary landscape of a mountain shortcut that at 2 a.m. in December contains something that the 12 hours between darkness and daylight erased completely. The cars and their engines and their headlights and whatever occupied their dark interiors withdrawn from the hollow, the way a tide withdraws from a beach, leaving the surface clean and undisturbed, and showing no trace of what the water held. The hollow is still there. The road still runs through it. And at 2 in the morning, in the December dark, I wonder whether the cars are there too, running, lit, waiting at their mile markers in the empty hollow. And I take the long way, every time. The East River Mountain Tunnel is a mile of bored rock on the Virginia-West Virginia border, the point where Interstate 77 passes through the mountain rather than over it. The engineering solution to a ridge that was too steep and too high for a highway to climb at interstate grade. The tunnel carries 2 lanes of traffic, one northbound and one southbound, separated by a concrete jersey barrier that runs the length of the bore, the lanes wide enough for trucks, the clearance high enough for standard commercial vehicles, the lighting consistent, the ventilation adequate, the whole structure maintained by the state transportation departments of both Virginia and West Virginia in a cooperative arrangement that keeps the tunnel operational 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It is the most utilitarian of structures, a hole through a mountain, designed for the single purpose of getting vehicles from one side to the other, and I have driven through it so many times that the experience has been compressed into a sensory nothing. The tunnel registering as a brief change in light and sound, and then the daylight or the darkness on the other side, and the drive continuing, without the tunnel having made any impression on my conscious mind. I drive I-77 for work. I'm a long-haul driver for a freight company based in Wytheville, Virginia, running loads north into West Virginia and Ohio and Pennsylvania and back, the corridor that takes me through the East River Mountain Tunnel at least twice a week, sometimes more. The tunnel, a fixed point on a route that I've been driving for 14 years. I've driven through it in every condition, rain and snow and fog and the particular ice that forms on the road surface inside tunnels when the temperature drops and the moisture in the air condenses on pavement that is cooler than the air outside. I've driven through it in heavy traffic and in no traffic and at every hour of the day and night. The tunnel is a known quantity, a constant in a job that has few constants, the mile of bored rock that is always the same width and the same height and the same length, and that carries the same 2 lanes through the same mountain every time I enter it. February of 2023. A Wednesday night, technically Thursday morning, approximately 3 a.m. I was driving southbound, empty, having dropped a load in Charleston and heading back to Wytheville for a reload that was scheduled for 6 a.m. The interstate was empty in the way that interstates are empty at 3 a.m. in February in the Appalachian Mountains. The traffic reduced to the occasional truck and the rare passenger vehicle, the road belonging to the overnight drivers who keep the freight moving while the rest of the country sleeps. The weather was clear, the temperature in the low 20s, the road dry, the driving conditions as good as February in the mountains provides. I approached the tunnel from the north, the West Virginia side, the road descending slightly toward the portal, the tunnel entrance visible ahead as a rectangle of artificial light set into the dark face of the mountain, the sodium lights inside the bore producing the amber glow that tunnels emit at night, the particular color of underground illumination that is neither daylight nor darkness, but something between. I entered the tunnel at 65 miles per hour, the speed limit through the bore, the truck passing from the open air of the mountain road into the enclosed space of the tunnel, with the familiar transition, the sound changing as the walls closed in, the engine noise and the tire noise reflecting off the rock and the concrete, the air pressure shifting slightly as the sealed space of the tunnel replaced the open atmosphere of the outside. The tunnel was wrong. I registered it within the first 100 yards, not consciously, not as a thought that I could have articulated in the moment. The registration was physical, a discomfort that started in my peripheral vision and radiated inward, the body processing information that the conscious mind hadn't yet identified, the particular unease that the brain produces when the spatial parameters of a familiar environment have changed, and the change is significant enough to trigger an alert but subtle enough that the nature of the change hasn't been determined. I looked right. My lane was correct. The southbound lane, the pavement marked with the standard white lines, the concrete barrier to my left, separating me from the northbound lane, the tunnel wall to my right where the curved, tiled surface of the bore defined the boundary of the passable space. Except the wall wasn't there. To my right, where the tunnel wall should have been, where the tiled surface of the bore should have curved down from the ceiling to meet the roadway at the edge of the shoulder, there was space. Additional space, extending to the right beyond the shoulder, a lane width of surface running parallel to my lane, the space continuing as far as I could see in my peripheral vision, running the length of the tunnel beside me. The additional lane was not lit. The tunnel's lighting, the sodium fixtures mounted on the ceiling at regular intervals, illuminated the two normal lanes and the barrier and the shoulders, and stopped at the point where the tunnel wall should have begun. Beyond that point, to my right, the space was dark. Not completely dark, the ambient light from the tunnel fixtures reaching into the additional space with enough strength to show the surface. But the illumination was weak and angled and fell off rapidly. The additional lane existing in a half-light that showed the ground but not the walls, the surface but not the boundaries. The surface was wrong, not pavement, not the smooth, sealed asphalt that the tunnel's driving lanes were surfaced with. The additional lane showed bare rock, rough, unfinished, the native stone of the mountain visible as a gray-brown surface that had been carved but not lined, not tiled, not treated in any way that the engineering of the tunnel had applied to the usable space. It was as if the tunnel had been excavated wider than the finished bore, an additional lane width of rock removed from the mountain's interior and left in its raw state, the space present but unfinished, existing parallel to the completed tunnel, like a rough draft beside a final copy. I was driving at 65 miles per hour through a tunnel that I had driven through thousands of times, and the tunnel was wider than it had ever been, and the additional space was dark and rough and running beside me for the entire length of the bore. I gripped the wheel and I maintained my lane, and I looked at the dark space to my right with the particular intensity of a man who needs to understand what he's seeing and who is traveling too fast to stop and examine it, and who is processing the impossible in real time at highway speed. Something was in the dark lane, not at the edge of the lit space where I might have been able to see it clearly. Deeper in the dark, further right, in the section of the additional lane where the tunnel's ambient light failed and the darkness was nearly complete. A shape, moving, traveling in the same direction I was traveling, southbound through the mountain, keeping pace with my truck at 65 miles per hour. The shape visible not as a defined form, but as a region of darker darkness within the already dark space, a density in the unlit lane that was moving with me, matching my speed with the same precision that a vehicle in the adjacent lane would match your speed on a highway. The shape was large, not vehicle-sized, but larger than a person, the dark region occupying a volume that suggested something massive, moving through the unfinished lane with a speed and a fluidity that the rough rock surface should not have permitted. I could not determine edges or features or any characteristic beyond size and movement, and the particular quality of presence that the shape communicated. The certainty that something was there, that the dark lane was not empty, that the space running parallel to my tunnel contained something that was using it as a corridor through the mountain. I drove. The tunnel is a mile long. At 65 miles per hour, a mile takes approximately 55 seconds. I drove through the tunnel in 55 seconds, and for every one of those seconds, the dark lane was to my right, and the shape was in it, moving beside me through the mountain, keeping pace, the dark form traveling through the unlit, unfinished space with a purpose that was parallel to mine, and that I could not determine beyond the fact of its movement and the fact of its presence. The exit appeared. The south portal, the Virginia side, the rectangle of darkness that was the outside air, the tunnel ending and the mountain releasing the road back into the open atmosphere of the ridge. I drove through the portal, and the tunnel was behind me, and the road ahead was the normal interstate, 2 lanes, open sky, the mountain receding in my mirrors. I looked in the mirror. The tunnel entrance behind me showed 2 lanes. The amber lighting illuminated the bore, the concrete barrier visible down the center, the walls curving down to meet the roadway on both sides. 2 lanes, normal width. The tunnel I had driven through thousands of times, the mile of bored rock that was always 2 lanes wide, and that was 2 lanes wide in my mirror, and that had been 55 seconds ago, 3 lanes wide with something moving in the 3rd lane beside me. I pulled over. The shoulder on the Virginia side of the tunnel, maybe a quarter mile from the portal. I stopped the truck and sat in the cab and looked at the tunnel entrance in my mirror and processed what I had just driven through. The tunnel glowed amber. It showed 2 lanes. It was the tunnel it had always been. I've driven through the East River Mountain Tunnel hundreds of times since February of 2023. Every time, I look right. Every time the wall is there, the tiled surface of the bore curving from ceiling to road, the boundary of the passable space defined and solid, and where it should be. 2 lanes, normal width, the tunnel performing its function without variation. But I think about the rock. The mountain that the tunnel passes through is not hollow. It's solid rock for miles in every direction. The mass of the East River Mountain extending above and around the bore. The tunnel, a narrow cylinder of space cut through millions of tons of stone. The rock is there whether the tunnel is there or not. The mountain existed before the tunnel and will exist after the tunnel, and the tunnel is a temporary passage through something permanent. And I think about what else the mountain might contain. The tunnel was carved through the rock by machines that cut a specific width for a specific purpose. But the rock extends beyond the cut. The mountain holds more space than the tunnel occupies. And if the tunnel can exist in the rock, if a mile of passable space can be carved through solid mountain, then other spaces might exist in the rock too. Natural spaces, voids, the particular geology of limestone and sandstone that produces caves and passages and chambers in mountain interiors throughout the Appalachian chain. Something moved through a space beside the tunnel on a February night. Something large and fast and present in a lane that the tunnel doesn't normally show and that the morning's drive doesn't contain. A dark shape moving through the mountain at 65 miles per hour in a space that was rough and unlit and that existed for 55 seconds and that I have never seen again. The tunnel is 2 lanes wide. It has always been 2 lanes wide. And on one night in February, at 3 a.m., it was 3 lanes wide, and the 3rd lane was dark and rough and occupied by something that used the mountain's interior as a corridor. And I drive through the tunnel twice a week, and the wall is always there. And I look right every time, and the tunnel is 2 lanes wide. Every time. So far. I sell insurance in the rural counties of eastern Kentucky, which means I drive. That's the job in a way that the word selling doesn't capture. The actual labor of the work measured not in policies written or premiums collected, but in miles driven. The hours spent in a truck moving between the small towns and the hollows and the scattered communities that make up my territory. The territory covers 4 counties, Breathitt and Owsley and Lee and Wolfe, some of the most remote and least populated terrain in the state, the mountain counties, where the roads follow the creek bottoms through hollows that narrow to nothing, and where the distance between towns is measured not in miles but in the particular currency of mountain driving, which is time, the 30 minutes or 45 minutes or hour that the terrain extracts from every trip regardless of how short the distance looks on a map. I know these roads the way a sailor knows a coastline, by the landmarks and the hazards, and the particular feel of terrain that becomes automatic after enough repetition. I know where the cell service fails. I know where the road washes out in spring. I know the stretches where the coal trucks dominate the lane and where you pull over and wait, because arguing with a loaded coal truck on a mountain road is an argument you lose. I've driven every mile of these counties, in every season, in every weather, and at every hour. The nighttime drives as familiar as the daytime ones, the mountains at night holding no mystery for someone who has been driving through them for 15 years. September of 2022, a Thursday night, around 10 o'clock. I'd been in Jackson that afternoon meeting with a client whose farm was being restructured and whose policies needed updating. The kind of meeting that runs longer than scheduled because the conversation extends beyond insurance into the general business of a farmer's life. And because in these counties, the agent who doesn't sit and talk and drink coffee and listen to the things that aren't about insurance is the agent who loses the client. I left Jackson later than intended, the September dark settling over the mountains with the particular speed that fall produces when the days shorten and the sun drops behind the ridges and the hollows fill with shadow, as if someone had poured it in from above. The route home took me through a section of Breathitt County that I'd driven hundreds of times, a state road that followed a creek through a hollow and connected to the highway that would take me back to my own county. The road was familiar, the terrain familiar, the particular curves and grades and straightaways committed to the muscle memory that develops when you drive the same routes for 15 years, and your body knows the road before your headlights show it. The fuel gauge caught my attention about 20 minutes into the drive. I'd been running low when I left Jackson and had intended to fuel up at the station on the edge of town, the one I always used, and had somehow driven past it without stopping, the meeting occupying my thoughts past the point where the station sat, and the road carried me into the hollow before I remembered. The gauge was showing just above the red, the low fuel warning light active. The truck's computer estimating approximately 20 miles of range remaining. The next town was at least 15 miles away, maybe more depending on which route I took, and the 15 miles were mountain miles on a road that climbed and descended, and that the truck's engine consumed fuel on at a rate that flat road estimates didn't account for. I drove with the particular attention of someone who is watching a fuel gauge decline and calculating the mathematics of distance versus fuel versus terrain, the anxious arithmetic that turns every hill into a cost and every downgrade into a slight reprieve. The road wound through the hollow, the creek beside it, the forest dark on both sides, the September night showing the stars through the gaps in the canopy where the trees hadn't fully recovered their summer density. I came around a curve and saw lights. On the right side of the road, set back maybe 30 feet from the pavement on a flat area that had been graded and graveled, a gas station, small. 2 pumps, the old style, the tall rectangular units with the mechanical counters that scrolled numbers as the gas flowed, the kind of pumps that independent stations used before the industry converted to the electronic displays that modern stations use. The pumps were lit, the fluorescent canopy above them producing the white-blue light that gas station canopies cast, the light reaching across the gravel to the edge of the road. Behind the pumps, a building, a small cinder block structure, single story, with a glass front door and windows that showed the interior, the lights on inside, the shelves visible through the glass, the particular look of a small rural gas station that serves a community too small to attract a chain. The sign showed gas prices. I remember the numbers because the numbers were part of what I noticed and didn't process, and that I later recognized as the first indicator that something was wrong. The prices were low, significantly below what I was paying at every other station in the region, low enough that they should have registered as suspicious, but that in the moment registered only as welcome. The response of a man who was almost out of gas, and who was seeing gas, and who wasn't inclined to question the price. I pulled in. The gravel crunched under my tires, in the particular way that station gravel crunches, the loose stone compressed by the truck's weight, the sound familiar and ordinary. I stopped beside the pump, the driver's side adjacent to the nozzle, the standard positioning that I performed at gas stations every week without thinking about it. I got out. The air was cool, September mountain air, the smell of the hollow mixing with the gasoline smell that every station produces, the volatile organic compounds evaporating from the pumps and the underground tanks and the ground around them. I picked up the nozzle. The pump was the old mechanical type, the handle and the trigger and the rubber hose and the rectangular counter with its scrolling numbers. I inserted the nozzle, squeezed the trigger, and the gas flowed, the counter scrolled. The nozzle delivered fuel with the normal sound and the normal vibration of gasoline being pumped from an underground tank through a hose into a vehicle. The fuel gauge on my truck's dashboard began to climb, the needle moving from just above red toward the quarter tank mark and then the half tank mark, the tank filling with gasoline that came from a pump that worked and a station that was lit and a set of underground tanks that contained fuel. I went inside to pay. The glass door opened with the resistance of a door that has a closer on it, the pneumatic arm slowing the door's swing, the mechanism producing the particular hiss that commercial door closers produce. The interior was small, maybe 20 by 15 feet, the standard layout of a rural gas station store, shelves on the walls, a counter at the back, a cooler against one wall, the floor tile, the ceiling fluorescent, the general appearance of a small business that is functional without being modern. I noticed the products on the shelves without focusing on them. Candy bars, snacks, the inventory that gas stations carry. The packaging was familiar in a general sense, but specific in a way that I registered as odd without processing as significant. The brands recognizable, but the designs of the packaging different from what I was accustomed to seeing. The colors and the fonts and the particular look of the labels, carrying a quality that I couldn't name in the moment and that I would later identify as temporal. The products looking like products from a different time, the packaging dated, the designs belonging to a decade that wasn't this one. The woman behind the counter took my cash. I handed her a 20, and she made change and put the bills and the coins on the counter, and I picked them up and put them in my pocket. She said nothing. Not hello, not the total, not the standard verbal exchange that occurs between a cashier and a customer at a gas station 100 times a day. She took the money and made change and looked at me with a face that I cannot describe because I cannot remember it. I have tried many times to recall the face of the woman behind the counter, and I cannot produce a single feature, not the color of her hair or the shape of her eyes or the age of her skin. She is a blank where a face should be, the memory of a transaction without the memory of the person who conducted it. I drove away. The truck ran well, the tank full or nearly full. The fuel gauge showing the comfortable middle range. That means you have range and time and don't need to think about gas stations for another 200 miles. I drove home and went to bed and didn't think about the station again for a week. I mentioned it to a friend, Ray, a man who'd grown up in Breathitt County and who knew every road and every business in the county with the encyclopedic knowledge of someone who'd been driving the same terrain his entire life. I mentioned the station in passing, noting the low prices, describing the location on the road through the hollow, the 2 pumps, and the cinder block building and the flat gravel lot. Ray looked at me with an expression that I didn't immediately recognize, and that I later identified as the particular look of a man who has just heard something that doesn't make sense and who is trying to determine whether the speaker is joking. He said the station I was describing was Combs Station. He said it had been operated by a family named Combs for 30 years, serving the hollow and the communities around it, selling gas and groceries, and the particular inventory that small rural stations carry for customers who don't want to drive to town. He said it had closed in 2003, when the last Combs who ran it died and the family had no one willing to take it over. He said the building had been demolished in 2008 when the county cleared the site as part of a road improvement project. He said the site where the station had stood was now an empty lot with a concrete pad. I drove back to the location on a Saturday morning. I knew the road. I knew the curve. I knew the section of hollow where the station had been, the flat area on the right side where the gravel lot had provided room for the pumps and the building. The lot was empty. A concrete pad, maybe 30 by 40 feet, the surface cracked, weeds growing through the fractures, the pad showing the particular deterioration of concrete that has been exposed to mountain weather for 15 years without maintenance. No building, no pumps, no canopy, no sign. Nothing but the concrete pad and the weeds and the flat area where gravel had once been and where the years had compressed it into the ground until only the scattered stones at the edges showed it had been there. I stood on the concrete pad and I looked at the empty lot and I thought about the gas pump that had worked and the fuel that had flowed and the woman who had taken my cash and made change and whose face I couldn't remember. The gas was real. My truck had been nearly empty and now it was full, and the miles I'd driven since that night had consumed the fuel with the normal rate that gasoline is consumed, the energy produced by combustion, the truck powered by fuel that had come from a pump at a station that didn't exist. I'd paid cash, which meant there was no electronic record of the transaction, no credit card statement, no receipt from a point-of-sale system. Just the gas in my tank and the memory of a station that was lit and operating on a September night in a hollow in Breathitt County, where the station had been demolished 14 years earlier. I've driven that road many times since. The lot is always empty. The concrete pad sits in the weeds. The hollow holds its darkness and its curves and its creak, and the empty space where a station used to be. I've driven past the site at night, at the same hour, in the same season, looking for the lights that I saw on that September evening. The site is dark. The hollow is dark. The station is gone. Except once it wasn't. Once, on a night when I was almost out of gas and the road was dark and the nearest town was 15 miles away, the station was there, lit and operating and pumping fuel that was real enough to power my truck for 200 miles. Staffed by a woman whose face I can't remember, and who sold me gas at prices that belonged to a different year from a station that belonged to a different decade. I keep the change in a cup on my dresser, the bills and the coins that the woman put on the counter and that I put in my pocket. I haven't spent them because spending them feels like it would complete a transaction that I'm not sure was a transaction in any sense that my understanding of transactions accommodates. The bills are normal, the coins are normal, legal tender, current issue, showing no evidence of age or origin that would distinguish them from any other bills and coins in circulation. Normal money. From a station that doesn't exist. For gas that was real. And the hollow holds what it holds. And the concrete pad sits in the weeds. And on certain September nights, when the fuel gauge drops and the darkness closes in, and the road through the hollow curves toward the place where the station used to be, I wonder whether the lights will be on, and whether the pumps will work. And whether the woman will take my money and make change, and look at me with a face that I'll forget the moment I drive away. The station closed 20 years ago, but the gas was real, and the change is on my dresser, and the truck ran on fuel that came from somewhere that isn't there anymore. Or that's there only when you need it, only when the gauge is low and the night is dark and the hollow decides to give you what you need, and then takes it back. And the morning shows an empty lot, and the gas burns normally, and the memory holds everything except the face. I've been a paramedic in Bath County, Virginia, for 9 years, which in rural emergency medicine means I'm a generalist by necessity and a specialist in the particular challenges that mountain terrain imposes on the practice of keeping people alive long enough to reach a hospital. The county covers 532 square miles, the population is about 4,000, and the nearest trauma center is an hour and 15 minutes by ambulance on roads that were designed for the pace of horse-drawn travel and that have been widened just enough to accommodate the vehicles that replace the horses without fundamentally altering the routes that the terrain dictated 200 years ago. The roads follow the rivers and the creeks through valleys that are narrow and steep-sided, the mountains pressing close, the curves frequent and tight, the grades steep enough that an ambulance loaded with a patient and 2 medics, and the equipment that modern emergency medicine requires handles differently than the same ambulance empty, the weight shifting the center of gravity, the braking distances extending, the whole vehicle performing as a different machine than the one you drove to the call. The valley where it happened runs along the Jackson River, one of the primary drainages in the western part of the county, a broad valley by Appalachian standards, maybe a half-mile wide at its widest, the river running through the center, the road following the river on the eastern bank, the ridges rising on both sides to heights that block the sky in the early morning and the late afternoon when the sun is low. The valley is known for fog, not the general fog that any valley produces, but the particular radiation fog that forms in Appalachian river valleys when the conditions align, the clear nights when the ridges radiate their heat into the atmosphere, and the cold air drains downslope into the valley and meets the moisture rising from the river, and produces a ground-level cloud that fills the valley from bank to bank, and that can reduce visibility to less than a car. Length, the kind of fog that is not a weather condition but an environment, a physical medium that you drive through and that resists your headlights and your speed and your desire to see what's in front of you. October of 2022, a Friday night, technically Saturday morning, approximately 1 a.m. My partner Mike and I were returning from a transport, a cardiac patient that we'd taken to the hospital in Staunton, the nearest facility that could handle the case. A 45-minute drive that the urgency of the patient's condition had compressed to about 35. The patient was delivered, the paperwork was filed, and we were heading back to the station in the empty ambulance. The particular lightness that the truck has when the stretcher is unloaded and the compartment is empty, and the urgency has been replaced by the routine of the return trip. Mike was driving. He's been on the department longer than I have, 12 years, and he drives the mountain roads with the unconscious competence of someone who has been navigating them so long that the curves and the grades and the particular hazards of each section are handled by a system that operates below conscious thought. He's a good driver in conditions that test good drivers. The mountain roads requiring a specific set of skills that flat road driving doesn't develop, the ability to read terrain and anticipate curves and modulate speed for grades, and to process the constant stream of information that mountain driving produces, the headlights showing road surface and shoulder and tree line, and the occasional pair of eyes reflecting from the darkness, where a deer is about to make the decision that determines whether you're filling out an accident report. Tonight, we hit the fog about 5 miles from the station. The transition was abrupt, the way valley fog presents itself. One moment the road was clear and the visibility was normal, and the next moment we were inside it, the headlights hitting a wall of white that reflected the light back at us with an intensity that made the visibility worse than if we'd been driving in the dark. Mike slowed immediately, dropping from 55 to about 15, the speed at which you can stop within the distance your low beams illuminate when the fog is thick enough to turn the air opaque. He switched from high beams to low, which reduced the reflected glare, and cracked the windows on both sides. The standard fog driving protocol in our department, the open windows allowing us to hear what we couldn't see, the sound of other vehicles or obstacles, or the particular acoustic change that occurs when the road surface changes or when the shoulder narrows. The fog was dense, the thickest I'd driven through in 9 years on the department, the visibility maybe 20 feet, the world compressed to a small sphere of illumination that moved with us and that showed road surface and the nearest few feet of shoulder and nothing beyond. The fog was white and uniform, and it seemed to produce its own light, the moisture particles catching the headlamps and scattering the photons in every direction, the air itself glowing in a way that was not illumination but diffusion, the light going everywhere and showing nothing. We'd been in the fog for about a mile when I saw the first shape. On the right side of the road, at the edge of the pavement, a dark vertical form visible through the fog as a slightly darker region in the white, not a tree. The trees along this section of road were set back from the pavement by maybe 10 feet, the shoulder wider here than on most mountain roads, and I could distinguish the tree line through the fog as a dark mass at a consistent distance from the road. The shape I was seeing was closer, at the pavement edge, on the line where the asphalt met the shoulder, standing with the vertical proportion of something that was approximately 5 to 6 feet tall, and that was narrow, and that was motionless. I watched it as we passed. The shape didn't move. It stood at the road's edge in the fog, and we drove past at 15 miles per hour, and I turned my head to track it through my window, and it remained in position, standing, motionless, a dark form in the white fog that held its ground as we passed. I didn't say anything. One shape at the road's edge in fog that reduced visibility to 20 feet was not necessarily anything. A fence post, a road marker, a deer standing still. The explanations were available, and I selected one without committing to it and faced forward. The second shape was on the left side of the road, maybe a quarter mile further. Same characteristics, dark, vertical, human height, standing at the pavement edge with the same motionless quality as the first. I saw it in the fog ahead of us, the form materializing out of the white as we approached, visible for maybe 3 or 4 seconds as we passed at 15 miles per hour, and then disappearing behind us into the fog. The third was on the right side, the fourth on the left, the fifth on the right, maybe 100 yards after the fourth, the spacing between the shapes irregular, but the presence consistent, the forms appearing at the road's edge with a frequency that was beginning to establish itself as a pattern rather than a series of coincidences. Mike said, "What are those after the seventh one?" He said it without inflection, the flat delivery of a man who is driving in zero visibility conditions and who is registering anomalous information without allowing it to interfere with the driving. His eyes were on the road, his hands on the wheel, his attention divided between the navigation that the fog demanded and the shapes that the fog contained. I said I didn't know. The response was honest, and it was inadequate, and it was the only response I had. The shapes were not trees. I could distinguish trees by their height and their position and their profile, the organic, irregular silhouettes of hardwood trunks, visible through the fog as forms that were clearly arboreal. These shapes were different, narrower than tree trunks, more uniform in height, positioned at the road edge rather than at the tree line, standing with a verticality that was geometric rather than organic, the particular uprightness of a body that is balanced on 2 points rather than rooted in the ground. We drove through approximately 2 miles of fog with the shapes standing at the road's edges. I counted 19. Mike may have counted differently, but I counted 19 dark, vertical, human height forms standing at irregular intervals on both sides of the road, motionless, positioned at the pavement edge, visible through the fog as presences rather than details, shapes that the fog showed in silhouette without revealing in specificity. They did not move. Not one of the 19 shapes showed any motion as we passed. They stood with the absolute stillness of objects rather than organisms, the particular quality of immobility that says not frozen but fixed, not waiting but stationed. The stillness was not the stillness of animals that go motionless when a vehicle approaches. It was the stillness of things that are in position and that have been in position and that will remain in position after you pass. The stillness of installation rather than reaction. I tried to extract detail from the shapes as we passed the closer ones. At 15 miles per hour, with the shapes at the road's edge, the nearest were maybe 6 feet from my window, close enough that in normal visibility, I would have been able to determine whether I was looking at a person or a post or a piece of equipment. In the fog, at 6 feet, I could see the shape and the size and the approximate proportion and nothing more. The fog did not permit detail. It showed outline and it withheld specificity with the particular frustration of a medium that lets you see enough to know something is there and not enough to know what it is. We exited the fog bank at the south end of the valley. The transition was as abrupt as the entry, the fog ending at a line where the valley narrowed and the terrain changed, and the cold air pool that produced the fog reached its boundary. One moment we were in white, and the next moment we were in clear, the road visible ahead for a normal distance, the headlights showing pavement and shoulder and tree line, and the clear dark air of an October mountain night. I looked back. The fog bank was behind us, a wall of white filling the valley, the road disappearing into it at the point where we'd emerged. The shapes were not visible from outside the fog. The fog held them the way a closed room holds its contents, showing nothing of what was inside to observers outside. Mike drove the remaining distance to the station in silence. We backed the ambulance into the bay and shut it down and did the post-call routine, cleaning and restocking and completing the paperwork that the transport required. Neither of us mentioned the shapes. The incident report for the transport documented the patient's condition and the treatment provided and the transport time and the receiving facility. It did not mention fog. It did not mention shapes. Incident reports document what happened to the patient. They do not have a field for what the crew saw on the road coming home. We talked about it a week later. In the station during a quiet shift, in the particular language of people who need to confirm that a shared experience was shared, Mike described what he'd seen: dark forms at the road's edge, vertical, human height, motionless. His description matched mine. His count was different. He'd counted 15 or 16 rather than my 19, the difference attributable to the fact that he was watching the road while I was watching the shoulders. But the description was the same: dark shapes in the fog, standing at the pavement edge, present for 2 miles, motionless. He asked me what I thought they were. I said I didn't know. He nodded. We didn't discuss it further. I've driven through that valley in fog many times since. The valley produces fog regularly in the fall and the spring, the conditions aligning often enough that driving through it in zero visibility is a routine part of the job. I watch the road edges. I look for the shapes. The fog shows me road and shoulder, and the diffused glow of my headlights, and sometimes the silhouette of a tree at the tree line and nothing else. The shapes have not returned. 2 miles of fog with 19 dark forms at the road's edge, and then nothing. The fog and subsequent drives containing only fog, and the road containing only road, and the shoulders holding nothing but gravel and grass. 19 shapes. Standing in the fog at 1 in the morning on a mountain road in Bath County, positioned at the pavement edge like markers or sentries, or the component elements of something that uses the fog as a medium, and that the fog reveals only under certain conditions to certain observers at certain hours. I don't know what they were. Mike doesn't know what they were. The fog knows, if fog can know, and the valley knows, if valleys can know, and the river that produces the moisture that produces the fog that filled the valley on that October night knows what stood in it and why. And I drive through the fog, every time it forms, looking at the road edges, counting the shapes that aren't there, waiting for the night when they are. I've been making the same drive for 11 years, which is long enough that the route has ceased to be a route and has become a reflex. The truck following the road from the hospital in Greenville to my house outside Irwin with the automatic precision of a body performing an action, it is performed so many times that the action requires no conscious direction. 30 minutes. 27 miles on a state highway that follows the Nolichucky River through a valley in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. The road running between the river and the ridges in a corridor that is beautiful during the day and unremarkable at night. The particular kind of landscape that you stop seeing when you drive through it every day because the seeing has been completed and what remains is the knowing, the route existing in your body as a sequence of curves and grades and landmarks that arrive at predicted intervals and that produce a drive time that is as consistent as anything in a life can be. I work the night shift at the hospital, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., 3 nights a week, which means I make the drive home at midnight or later, the highway empty, the valley dark, the river audible through the open window in summer and invisible behind the closed window in winter. The midnight drive is different from the daytime drive the way any familiar route is different at night. The landmarks reduced to what the headlights show, the curves arriving by feel rather than by sight, the particular intimacy of driving a road you know, in conditions that reveal only the immediate. I've made this drive hundreds of times at midnight. The drive takes 30 minutes, always. The consistency is so reliable that I don't check the time anymore. The arrival at home occurring at the expected moment with the predictability of a commute that has been calibrated by 11 years of repetition. January of 2023. A Wednesday night, my shift ending at midnight. The January cold producing the particular conditions that eastern Tennessee generates in winter. Clear skies, low humidity, temperatures in the teens, the kind of night that makes the stars sharp and the road surface dry, and the driving as straightforward as driving gets. I clocked out at midnight and walked to my truck in the hospital parking lot and started the engine and let it warm while I checked my phone and noted the time, 12:03 a.m., and pulled out of the lot and turned onto the highway and began the drive home. The first few miles were normal. The highway left Greenville through the commercial district, the gas stations, and the fast food restaurants that served the hospital staff at shift change, and then the town fell away, and the road entered the valley, and the terrain took over. The river to my left, the ridges to my right, the highway following the corridor between them in the series of gentle curves that the river's path dictated. My headlights showed the road ahead, the white line, the yellow center line, the shoulders, the guardrails where the road ran close to the river, the familiar sequence of visual cues that the midnight drive produced and that my body processed without requiring my mind's participation. I passed the first landmark, a church, white clapboard, sitting on the right side of the highway at a point that I knew was 4 miles from the hospital. The church arrived on schedule, the headlights catching the white siding and the steeple as I passed, the landmark registering with the unconscious acknowledgement that the body gives to expected stimuli. 4 miles down, 23 to go, the drive proceeding normally. The second landmark was a bridge, a 2-lane concrete span where the highway crossed a tributary of the Nolichucky at a point that was approximately 8 miles from the hospital. I'd been driving for what felt like the correct amount of time since the church, the minutes accumulating at the normal rate, the truck maintaining 55 miles per hour, the highway unfolding ahead of me in the headlights, with the standard sequence of curves and straightaways. I crossed the bridge and something shifted, not in the road, not in the landscape, not in any physical parameter that I could identify. The shift was temporal. The bridge was at the 8-mile mark, and the church had been at the 4-mile mark, and the distance between them was 4 miles, and at 55 miles per hour, 4 miles takes approximately 4.5 minutes, and drive between the two landmarks had taken approximately 9 minutes. I noticed this the way you notice a slight fever, not through measurement, but through the body's awareness that something is off. The internal clock that tracks time without reference to watches or phones, producing a signal that said the interval between landmarks was longer than it should have been. I checked the clock on the dashboard, Schalufen. 13 minutes since I'd left the hospital. At 55 miles per hour, 13 minutes should have put me at approximately 12 miles from the hospital. I was at the 8-mile bridge. I told myself I'd been driving slower than I thought. The explanation was simple and available, and I accepted it with the particular willingness of a man who is tired from a 12-hour shift and who wants the drive home to be normal, because normal is what lets him stop thinking and start resting. I pressed the accelerator slightly, confirming my speed at 55, and I drove on. The next landmark was a gas station at what I knew was the 12-mile mark, a closed station with a lit canopy that stayed on all night and that served as a reference point on the midnight drives, the particular beacon that said I was approximately halfway home. I watched for it. The road curved and straightened and curved again, the headlights showing the familiar terrain, the river, the ridges, the guardrails, everything correct, everything where it should be, the route producing the visual sequence that 11 years of driving had burned into my recognition system. The gas station appeared, the lit canopy, the dark building, the empty lot. I checked the clock, 12:29, 26 minutes since departure. At 55 miles per hour, 12 miles should take approximately 13 minutes. It had taken 26, double. The time between the hospital and the 12-mile gas station was exactly double what the physics of speed and distance required. I was fully alert now, the fatigue of the shift replaced by the particular sharpness that anomaly produces, the body's response to information that doesn't fit the pattern. I checked my speedometer, 55. I checked the road. Correct, the highway I drove every night, the landmarks in the right order, the curves where they should be, the terrain matching the terrain I knew. I was on the right road at the right speed, and the drive was taking twice as long as it should. I started watching the mile markers. The small green signs with white numbers that the state places at 1-mile intervals along state highways, the markers that I normally passed without noticing, because the markers were part of the background noise of the drive rather than information I needed. I found the next one, mile marker 23, which was correct for my position on the highway. I checked the clock and waited for mile marker 24. The mile took 2 minutes. At 55 miles per hour, 1 mile takes 1 minute and 5 seconds. Mile marker 23 to mile marker 24 took 2 minutes and 10 seconds. I was driving at 55 miles per hour, and the mile between the markers took double the time that 55 miles per hour produces. I pressed the accelerator. 60 miles per hour, 65. I watched the speedometer needle hold steady at 65, and I waited for the next mile marker, 2 minutes and 3 seconds. Faster speed, same doubled time, the distance between markers stretching to absorb whatever speed I applied to it, the road maintaining its temporal distortion regardless of how fast I drove. I pulled over. On the shoulder, the truck stopped, the engine idling, the headlights illuminating the road ahead, which looked exactly like the road it was. A state highway in a valley in eastern Tennessee, the pavement and the lines and the guardrails and the river beyond, everything correct, everything normal, everything identical to the road I'd been driving for 11 years, except that the road was taking twice as long to traverse as the physics of motion required. I sat in the truck for maybe 2 minutes. The clock on the dashboard advanced normally. The seconds ticked at the rate that seconds tick, 1 per second, the clock functioning correctly, time passing at the normal rate inside the truck, while the distance outside the truck had doubled. I drove on. There was nothing else to do. The road went home, and home was where I was going, and stopping on the shoulder of a highway at midnight wasn't going to change whatever was happening to the distance between the mile markers. I drove at 55, and I watched the markers pass at 2-minute intervals, and I watched the landmarks arrive in the correct order at double the expected time, and I drove the remaining 15 miles in 30 minutes instead of 15. I pulled into my driveway at 1:33 a.m., 90 minutes. The clock on my dashboard and the clock on my phone and the clock on the microwave when I walked inside all agreed. 90 minutes for a 27-mile drive that takes 30 minutes, that has always taken 30 minutes, that the mathematics of 55 miles per hour and 27 miles dictates should take 30 minutes. I sat at the kitchen table, and I did the calculation that I'd been doing in my head since the bridge. 27 miles at 55 miles per hour equals 29 minutes and 27 seconds. I had driven at 55 miles per hour, confirmed by the speedometer, for 90 minutes, which at 55 miles per hour would cover 82.5 miles. The road was 27 miles long. I had driven 27 miles of road, and the driving had consumed the time equivalent of 82.5 miles. 55.5 extra miles. Of road that the map didn't show, of distance that the mile markers didn't measure, of space between landmarks that stretched to 3 times its normal length, while the landmarks themselves stayed in their correct positions, the reference points fixed, the space between them elastic, the road obeying its own geography, while the time refused to obey the speed. The drive has been normal every night since. 30 minutes, 27 miles, the landmarks at their predicted intervals, the mile markers passing at 1 minute and 5-second increments, the commute performing its expected function with the reliability that 11 years of repetition had established. But I check. Every night, when I clock out and walk to the truck and start the drive home, I check the time, and when I arrive, I check it again. And I measure the minutes against the miles, and I verify that 30 minutes is 30 minutes, and that the road between the hospital and my house is the 27 miles that the map says it is. It's been normal. Every night since January, the drive takes 30 minutes. The road behaves, the distance obeys. But I know that it didn't. Once. I know that on a January night, the road between my work and my home stretched to nearly 3 times its length, the space between landmarks expanding without the landmarks moving, the drive consuming 90 minutes of time that the physics of speed and distance cannot account for. And I wonder where I was during those extra 60 minutes. What road I was driving, what valley I was passing through, whether the road that my headlights showed me, the road that looked identical to my road with my landmarks and my mile markers, was my road at all, or whether on that January night the road I drove was a different road, a longer road, a road that used the same landmarks and the same mile markers, but that existed in a version of the valley where the distances between things were not the distances that the maps record. I was somewhere for 60 minutes that the geography of eastern Tennessee doesn't contain, on a road that shouldn't exist, in a valley that was mine and wasn't mine, driving at the correct speed on the correct road past the correct landmarks, and arriving an hour late because the road, for one night, was not the road it appeared to be. And the clock kept perfect time, and the speedometer read 55, and the road was the road. And I was an hour late getting home from a drive that takes 30 minutes, and the road has been normal since. But I check, every night, because the road stretched once, and a road that can stretch once can stretch again, and the next time it stretches, I don't know how long it will be, or where it will take me, or whether the landmarks that arrive at their predicted positions will lead to a home that is still my home, at the end of a drive that should take 30 minutes, and that took 90, and that might, next time, take longer. And the valley holds its distances, and the road holds its miles. And most nights, the two agree. Most nights,